Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I have been traveling alone for a while, needing to get away from everything. Work, the city, the noise. It felt like I was suffocating, trapped in a cycle that kept pulling me under. That's when I found the cabin, tucked away in the woods, far from the nearest town, with a view of the mountains that seemed to promise quiet, solitude, and peace. I found it on Airbnb, a place called Whispering Pines, run by a woman named Clara. Her profile picture was warm, a bit dated, but kind. She was middle-aged, with soft eyes that seemed genuine. The description of the cabin itself was perfect. Rustic, secluded, no one around for miles. A perfect place to recharge. The reviews were glowing. Most people mentioning how peaceful and safe they felt. Safe. That was the word. Safe. I made the reservation and arrived that evening, just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. Clara greeted me at the door, her smile wide, her handshake firm. She was a little too kind, but it didn't seem strange at the time. There was something about her, though, that made me feel uneasy. I shook it off. The air smelled fresh, pine trees all around. The sky painted in colors I hadn't seen in ages. After Clara gave me the tour of the cabin, showing me the living room, the kitchen, and the bathroom, she mentioned that she'd be around if I needed anything. She said she'd leave the key under the mat for me to use at any time. There was something comforting about that, something that made the isolation feel safe rather than lonely. The first night passed without incident. The wind rustled outside like an old friend, lulling me to sleep. I sank into the bed, the sheets cool against my skin, and drifted off into the kind of deep slumber that only comes when you've been running on fumes for too long. The next night, though, was different. I woke up at midnight, not because of a noise, not because of a dream, but because something in the air had shifted. The world outside had become still. Not silent, just still. The kind of stillness that settles in when the trees stop moving, when the creatures of the night stop making their usual sounds. That's when I heard it. A knock. It was soft at first, so soft I wasn't sure I'd heard it. I laid there, my eyes wide open in the dark, straining to listen. There it was again, a soft knock, like someone tapping on the wood of the front door. I told myself it was the wind, the house settling. But then it came again, this time louder, more insistent. I sat up in bed, the air in the room thick with unease. My heart started to thud in my chest. What if it was someone outside? A neighbor, maybe? Or an animal? Some sort of creature scratching at the door? I pushed the covers off and stood up, my feet cold against the wooden floor. I walked toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing only darkness, the trees swaying gently in the wind. But no one was there, no one at all. Confused, I stepped outside for a moment, looking around, but nothing moved. The cabin was surrounded by miles of trees. No one could have been there without me hearing them approach. I closed the door behind me, double-checked the locks, and made my way back into the cabin. That's when I saw him. He was standing in the hallway just outside the bedroom door. I froze. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. He was tall, thin, his face pale, his expression blank. He didn't say anything, didn't even move. He just stood there, staring at me. His eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, locked onto mine. I couldn't tell you why, but there was something wrong about him. Something so wrong that I couldn't understand it at the time. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at each other, but it felt like hours. And then I screamed. I turned on the light, my pulse pounding in my ears, but when the light flickered on, he was gone. There was no sign of him, no sound of footsteps retreating. He was just gone. My breath came in sharp gasps. I ran to the phone and dialed Clara's number, praying she'd answer. But the call went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again. Nothing. My mind raced, every horrible scenario flashing through my head. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But no, I hadn't. I could still feel the cold weight of his gaze on me, like a physical pressure pressing against my chest. I bolted the door and stayed up the entire night, staring at the darkness, listening to every creak, every groan of the house. But nothing else came. The next morning, Clara arrived like nothing had happened. She knocked lightly on the door and entered with that same warm smile on her face. She made small talk, asked if I was enjoying my stay, and didn't seem the slightest bit concerned when I mentioned the strange encounter. She even seemed surprised that I'd locked the door. "Oh, don't worry about it," she said, almost too cheerfully. "This cabin is completely safe. Nothing ever happens here." But there was something different about her, something in her eyes. Her smile was too wide, too controlled. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her pupils dilated, her skin too pale. And then I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. In the living room, by the window, was a small photo album. It had been left out on the coffee table, but I hadn't noticed it before. Curious, I opened it. The first few pages were of Clara and her family. Holidays, vacations, smiling faces. But as I flipped through the pages, my stomach twisted into knots. The later photos were different. They showed Clara with various guests, different people who had stayed at the cabin over the years. But the last few pages were the most disturbing. There were photos of Clara with guests, except they weren't smiling. They were staring blankly at the camera, eyes wide, almost terrified. I recognized some of their faces. They were guests from the reviews. But that last photo was different. It was a picture of Clara standing next to a man. The man was the same pale figure I had seen in the hallway. The same hollow eyes, the same blank expression. I dropped the album, my hands shaking. I didn't stay another night. I packed up my things, left the key under the mat, and drove off without looking back. It wasn't until later that I found out something unsettling about the cabin. Clara had been renting it out for over a year. But the thing was, she never actually left it. She'd been living there, hiding in the shadows when guests arrived, watching them, waiting. I don't know what happened to the previous guests, but I'm sure they didn't leave the way they came. And I'm sure I'll never forget the man in the hallway, the guest who never left. Story 2. I had always been the kind of person who craved escape, a little time to myself in a place where nobody knew my name, where I could unplug from the world. That's why when I found the listing for the Airbnb, I thought it was the perfect opportunity. A sleek, modern loft in the heart of the city, surrounded by vibrant streets and endless things to do. The photos were pristine, every corner immaculate, every wall white and bright. The reviews? Too good to be true. 5 stars from people who couldn't say enough about how much they loved the place. But even before I opened the door to the loft, there was this nagging feeling at the back of my mind. You know that feeling you get when something is just a little too perfect? Like when everything is laid out so neatly, you almost start to wonder who's trying to hide something. But I shoved the feeling aside, chalking it up to pre-trip jitters. After all, what could go wrong? The host, a woman named Emily, greeted me with a forced smile when I arrived. She showed me the basics, how to work the lights, the Wi-Fi code, the coffee machine. But she didn't stay long. She told me she'd be out for the evening and that I should make myself at home. Her voice was soft, almost too soft, and she lingered by the door just a second too long before stepping out, leaving me alone in the place. The first few hours were perfect. I wandered around the city, grabbing coffee at a little corner shop and doing some window shopping. The kind of things you do when you're in a new place and you want to feel alive for a little while. But as night fell and I settled into the loft, I couldn't shake that odd sensation from earlier. It wasn't the loft itself. It was a room at the far end of the apartment. I had noticed it when I first walked in. There was a door there, tucked away behind a heavy curtain. Nothing out of the ordinary, except the door was locked. Not just lock-barred. There was no handle, no keyhole, no way to get in. Just an empty, closed-off space. The more I tried to ignore it, the more I became fixated on it. It wasn't just curiosity, but something darker, something pulling me toward it. The room stood there, mocking me, daring me to find out what lay behind it. I tried to shake it off. The logical part of me told me that it wasn't worth my time, that I was being paranoid, but something inside me knew better. That night, when the city quieted down, I heard Emily leave. I knew she was gone for the night. I'd heard her keys jingle and the sound of her footsteps on the stairs. That was my chance. I waited for a while, making sure there was no sign of her returning. Then, I found the spare key Emily had left in a small, dusty drawer by the kitchen. My heart raced, my palms sweaty as I approached the locked room. Something told me that if I opened it, I would never be the same, but I couldn't resist. I turned the key, and the door opened with a low, groaning sound, almost like it was reluctant to let me in. The room inside wasn't like the rest of the loft. It was dark, cold, and untouched, as though the air had been stale for years. Dust hung thick in the air, clinging to the furniture like a heavy fog. There were cobwebs in the corners, the kind that make you feel like the room has been abandoned for decades, not just hidden away for a few days. But what really caught my attention was the wall at the far end of the room. Behind an old, heavy bookshelf, there was a door, a small, nearly invisible door, almost as if it was meant to be missed. I approached it slowly, as if it might bite. My heart thudded in my chest, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. With shaking hands, I pulled the bookshelf out of the way. The door behind it was old, rusted, and covered in grime. But when I touched the handle, it turned easily, as if it had been waiting for me. There was a moment when I hesitated. A voice in the back of my head screamed at me to turn around, to to leave before it was too late. But my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I pushed the door open and found myself staring down a narrow, steep stairwell. It was pitch black, save for the faintest hint of light from somewhere far below. A cold draft billowed up, carrying with it the scent of decay and rot. I had no idea why I went down those stairs. I should have turned back. I should have locked the door behind me and gone to bed. But instead, I stepped into the darkness, flashlight in hand, my mind racing with possibilities of what I might find. The further I went down, the colder it became. The walls were lined with cracks, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. As I reached the bottom, I found myself standing in a room that looked like it had been frozen in time. Old, yellow journals were scattered across a wooden table in the center, and I could tell from the way they were piled that no one had touched them in years. I picked up the first journal, brushing the dust off the cover. The pages inside were worn, the ink faded with age. But what was written in those journals made my blood run cold. Each one detailed the experiences of previous guests who had stayed in the loft. The stories were eerily similar. People had written about hearing strange noises at night, seeing shadows moving in the corner of their eyes, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread in the locked room. Some even claimed to have seen a figure standing at the top of the stairs, watching them with hollow, empty eyes. The entries grew more frantic, more terrified, until the last journal was left unfinished, the words cut off in mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted. I couldn't stop reading. I had to know more, but as I flipped through the pages, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper coming from the darkness behind me. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the silence of the basement. But I could feel it. Something was there. Something was waiting. Suddenly, a cold hand landed on my shoulder. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, and that's when I saw it. The face, pale, hollow-eyed, deathly still. It looked like it had been carved from stone. Its skin was stretched too tight over its skull, and its eyes were black. Empty. I felt my legs give way as I stumbled backward, the journal slipping from my hands and falling to the floor with a sickening thud. I didn't wait to see more. I ran up the stairs, 2 at a time, my heart pounding in my ears, until I burst back into the room and slammed the door shut behind me. I didn't even stop to lock it. I just ran out of that apartment and into the cold, dark city night. When I finally made it outside, gasping for air, I looked back at the building. The lights in the loft were on, but there was no sign of Emily. There was no sign of anyone. I never went back to that place, and I don't think I ever will. I don't care if I was just imagining things. I don't care if it was all just a trick of the light, or my mind playing games with me. That place, it's haunted. And what I found down there in the dark is something I'll never forget. Later, I found out that the loft had a history, a tragic history. A young woman had died there years ago, her body discovered in the very basement I had ventured into. She had been locked in that room, forgotten, alone, but her death wasn't the end. The darkness in that place never left. It lingers, waiting for the next curious soul to uncover it. I just pray I'm the last. Story 3. I needed to get away. After everything that had been going on in my life, the breakup, the job loss, the endless cycle of exhaustion, I thought a quiet weekend in the middle of nowhere might do the trick. So when I found Mr. Thompson's Airbnb listing online, I thought, why not? A secluded little cabin, just far enough from the city to feel like an escape, but close enough to run errands if I needed. The reviews were glowing, but a little too glowing if you know what I mean. Everyone seemed to say the same thing. Quiet, peaceful, a great place to unwind. Maybe it was the lack of details that made it stand out. The host, Mr. Thompson, was an elderly man with soft, kind eyes, though there was something a little unsettling about him. He didn't say much when we met, just handed me the keys and pointed me toward the cabin. His home was a crumbling Victorian that looked like it belonged in an old horror film, complete with chipped paint, creaking windows, and the kind of air that always feels a bit too heavy. It was the kind of place where people might linger too long, maybe forget to leave, but I was too tired to be bothered by any of it. The peace and solitude would be enough. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked my things, set up a cozy little area with a blanket and a good book, and felt my body relax in a way it hadn't in months. The air outside smelled like pine, fresh and cool, and the house creaked in a way that seemed natural, like it was settling in for the night. I fell asleep easily, sinking into the comfort of the unfamiliar, that sense of freedom that comes from being alone, away from it all. But the second night, that's when things started to change. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up to the softest sound, a shuffle like someone dragging their feet across the carpet. I thought it was just the house, maybe the wind pushing against the walls, or the usual sounds of old floorboards groaning under the weight of time. I pulled the covers up to my chin and squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself I was being paranoid. But then it came again, a shuffle, closer this time. It was hard to pinpoint the sound. It wasn't footsteps, not exactly. It was like someone was pacing slowly, just outside my line of sight. My heart started to beat a little faster. I kept my eyes shut, holding my breath, willing myself to ignore it. But it came again, and this time it was unmistakable. It was right outside my door, no longer just some noise in the distance. The soft scrape of fabric on the floor, the faintest sound of a breath, just enough to send a chill crawling up my spine. I opened my eyes, blinking in the dark, trying to focus. My mind was racing, and I felt my chest tighten. I turned my head slowly, my gaze darting to the closet across the room. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see the darkness inside. But something wasn't right. There was something in there. At first, I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on me. But as I focused harder, I realized it was a shape, something standing in the far corner of the closet, barely visible. It was still, too still. I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat. My heart hammered in my chest, but I couldn't make a sound. I didn't even want to blink. I just stared, my mind screaming at me to look away, but my body refused to listen. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I don't know how long I stayed frozen, but eventually it happened. The figure stepped forward. It wasn't a swift movement. It was slow, deliberate. The shadows seemed to part as the figure emerged into the dim light of the room, and I could see its features, twisted and wrong. The pale, almost translucent skin, the hollow eyes that seemed to sink deeper into the darkness. The thin lips curled into a grin that made my blood run cold. It was him, Mr. Thompson. His face was stretched, twisted into something unrecognizable, like a nightmare version of the man I'd met just hours earlier. His eyes were wide, too wide, the pupils too small, as if they didn't belong in his skull. And that grin, I could feel it in my bones, a silent, suffocating grin that seemed to spread with a life of its own. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, my mouth too thick with fear to make a sound. My legs refused to move, my body paralyzed by something older than fear, something primal. He took another step, and I could smell the rot on him. Something old, something dead. That's when I snapped. I don't remember how, but I was out of bed and running for the door in a single movement. I didn't even look back. I could hear him behind me, but I didn't dare look. I threw open the door, slammed it shut, and ran into the cold night air. I didn't care about the keys, the bags, or the phone I'd left on the bedside table. I didn't care about anything but getting as far away from that house as possible. I don't know how long I drove, but I didn't stop until I was miles away. Every part of me was shaking, my skin cold, my mind still trying to process what had happened. When I finally felt my fingers steady enough to hold my phone, I Googled Mr. Thompson's name. My hand shook as I read the first result. Mr. Thompson had been living in that house alone for years. His wife, Eleanor, had gone missing in 1986, shortly after the house had been sold to him. The authorities had never found her body, but they suspected foul play. No one had ever seen or heard from Eleanor again. The neighbors, people who'd lived there their whole lives, spoke in hushed tones about the house. They all said the same thing. Mr. Thompson had never truly left. Even after his wife vanished, he stayed. They said they could hear him late at night, pacing around the house, shuffling, always the same shuffle. And when they'd ask him, he'd say, "You won't be the last." I never went back. I couldn't. The image of Mr. Thompson's twisted face stayed with me, and the sound of his shuffling footsteps echoed in my mind for weeks. It wasn't until much later, when I'd moved on and tried to forget about it all, that I found out the truth. The house was never meant to be rented, and Mr. Thompson had been waiting for me, just like he had waited for every guest before me, to be alone with them, to watch them, and I wasn't the last.